Welcome, bonjour, Quay. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge that the University of Ottawa, which is hosting this event, is built on unceded Algonquin land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory and pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders past, present, and future. So I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing this event, the second roundtable in the International Political Economy Network series on political economy in difficult times, revealing blind spots and reimagining theory and practice. This event is organized through the Center of International Policy Studies, CIPS, at the University of Ottawa. And we are at IPEN organizing 4 roundtables during this academic year. If you haven't seen the first one, the video recording of the first on whether neoliberalism is dead, I think the answer is mostly no, but anyway, I think that was the conclusion. That's up on our the CIPS YouTube channel. And then the next 2, there'll be one on the return of resource nationalism in February, and the last one will be on what is going on with money and inflation in early spring. So hopefully you can join us for all of these different events. But now, today's roundtable looks at why we need feminist political economy now more than ever. I want to say why this topic? Well, these roundtables, right, were inspired by the joint special issues that Geneviève LeBaron, Colin Hay, and Daniel Mugi and I edited, which sought to identify some key blind spots in international political economy. Ask ourselves, what are the kinds of things that scholars and policymakers have been missing that we need to pay attention to? What kinds of taken for granted concepts or issues do we need to re-examine and rethink? And it turns out that, in fact, so many of the issues we came up with or came to mind were ones that feminist political economists have been pointing to or shouting about for decades. The importance of caring labor, so very visible in the pandemic. And I say that also as a mother of elementary age twins, it came home, the importance and how we undervalue that. The ways in which our current economic thinking places so much attention on individual effort and responsibility, making it harder to see the ways in which class, race, and gender intersect to create such huge disparities in economic life chances. I've also had the enormous pleasure during the pandemic of teaching a course on the political economy of everyday life several times. And I've been struck time and time again how, as we are, whatever the topic we're talking about, money, work, consumption, the environment, COVID-19, the students keep making links back to our discussions on social reproduction and gender. So this is, again, this is a really important lens, I think, now more than ever. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to ask this panel of expert scholars and practitioners what they think. I'm going to be asking them these 3 key questions. That is, what can feminist political economy bring to our understanding of the political economy today? Will the new visibility of many of these key insights of feminist scholarship translate into policy changes? Or will the legacy of the pandemic be an intensification of these dynamics of inequality? Okay, so to let you know how things are going to work today, I've asked our 4 panelists to come up with pithy reflections on these questions. They just have 8 minutes to make their pitch. And then after each initial statement, one of the panelists has 3 minutes for a brief off-the-cuff comment, and then we're going to move on. And after everyone has had a chance to speak, we're going to open the floor for questions. Since this is a webinar format, you're going to have to write your question or comment in the Q&A section, and then I'm going to read them out either individually or I'll collect a few with similar themes and present them to the panelists who are going to respond to those comments and to each other. And that brings me to one of the best parts of my job, which is introducing our wonderful panelists, who include both scholars and practitioners who've made very important contributions to our understanding of feminist political economy. So I'm going to introduce them in the order that they are going to be making their main contributions. So I'll start with Geneviève LeBaron. She is a professor of politics at the University of Sheffield, where I had the very good fortune of spending 4 months working with her on our blind spot special issues a few years ago, in that time, distant pre-pandemic time. And in the new year, she is going to be coming back to Canada, which is just fantastic news for us, as the director of the Simon Fraser University School of Public Policy in Vancouver. Throughout her career, Geneviève has been a pioneer in studying forms of labor that many IPE scholars just don't pay enough attention to: forced labor, modern slavery, human trafficking. And as she does so, she has always paid very careful attention to the gender dynamics involved. Shirin Rai is our second speaker. She is a professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick and director of the Warwick International Research Center for International Development, Interdisciplinary Research Center for International Development. She has a long history of advancing scholarship on feminist political economy with field-defining books on feminist perspectives on global governance, gender, and the political economy of development. And her current research includes an analysis of the concept of depletion, which looks at the social costs of social reproduction work. Elizabeth Pruill is a professor of international relations and political science at the Graduate Institute of Geneva and also co-director of the Gender Center. Her research focuses on gender politics in global governance, and she's written on gender and the limits of current conceptions of labor, including a wonderful contribution to the Right special issue on blind spots. She's also looked at gender expertise in global governance and the neoliberalization of feminism. So a good link to our last roundtable. And Catherine Scott is a senior researcher at the Canadian Centre of Policy Alternatives, where she is the director for its gender equality and public policy work. And throughout her career, she's worked in the community sector as a researcher, a writer, and an advocate. In the last few years, she's written some really important reports on gender and the economy in Canada, including a fantastic study of women, work, and COVID-19, priorities for supporting women in the economy, which applies a gendered and intersectional lens to trace the impact of COVID-19 and government policies on women in Canada. So we have a wonderful group of women here to come and talk to you about these questions. So at this point, my only job is to turn over the floor to Geneviève, who is going to get us started.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you so much. I'm grateful to be speaking to you all today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I thank you so much to the organizers for bringing us all together. It's really such a tremendous honor for me to share a panel with Jackie and Lisa, Shirin, and Catherine. I hugely admire their work, and I'm indebted to it in terms of my own learning in this field, along with many of the brilliant feminist scholars that I see in the audience here. So it's really great to all be together today to talk about these issues. As Jackie noted, the global health catastrophe of COVID-19 has moved many topics that have long been considered vital and important by feminist political economists, but relatively ignored by scholars in our own discipline, by policymakers, by some of the public, into the global spotlight. And these include the ways in which those who have already been marginalized and vulnerable in the economy, including women and girls, often bear the brunt of health, social, and economic burdens attached to economic shocks. They include the disproportionate weight of unpaid care work that's carried by these people, and their disproportionate vulnerability to labor exploitation and forced labor in particular sectors of the economy. As Jackie said, I research labor, so maybe uncreatively, I'm going to focus my comments on this theme of labor and the impacts on the labor market that we've seen during the pandemic, especially the surge in gender inequities that we've seen relating to work, which cut across the whole spectrum, I think, of labor in society, from paid to unpaid, from well-remunerated to low wage, from jobs in places like Canada and the United Kingdom to jobs in global supply chains. And here I want to note two things, which are both, observations that feminists have been making for a very long time. They're not new, but I think the pandemic really brought them to light in a way that was mind-opening for many who perhaps hadn't seen them so clearly before. And the first is that the pandemic has made it very clear that labor force participation, earnings, which are fundamental to most people in terms of being able to get the goods and services that they need to survive, are shaped by social inequities that surround reproductive labor. So feminists have long argued this. And during the pandemic in countries like Canada and the United States, we've seen that women, and especially LGBTQ+ women and women of color, have been disproportionately impacted by job losses. That's because they tend to be concentrated in sectors that have been hard hit, like hospitality, And the numbers here are really shocking. So if we look at the United States, for instance, 2.3 million women, left the US labor force in 2020. There are similar numbers in Canada that I think Catherine might go into. And we just see that there's been this just mass exodus really of women workers from the paid labor force. There are many reasons for this. One key reason though, that I think is important because it touches on something that's been important to feminist political economy for a long time, is that a key driver has been the dramatic increase in their reproductive labor. So as education, healthcare, care work have been abruptly relocated into private homes, we've seen that there's this deepening inequity of responsibility for those tasks and duties, and that this has also shaped who can access and afford to be part of the labor market. And I suspect other speakers might go more deeply into that. So I'm going to skip on to the next point, which is that, when we look at people who have remained in the labor market, we also see deepening gendered inequity. So during the pandemic, I led a study to look at how COVID-19 was impacting workers in the global garment supply chain. Just to take one example, focusing on workers in Honduras, India, Myanmar, and Ethiopia, we included about 1,200 workers in our study who reported making clothes for big brands like Adidas, Gap, H&M, Nike, Gildan, many Canadian companies. And we included workers who'd been laid off during the pandemic and those who had continued to work in the same factory in the pandemic. And we were really looking at patterns with respect to indicators that are indicators of forced labor. So things like physical abuse and coercion, the imposition of debt by employers, various forms of coercion that workers might face. And we were trying to understand the patterns there, both individual patterns, but also the workplace patterns, national patterns, et cetera, across vulnerability to forced labor and how it was reshaped during the pandemic. And what we found is that there's been, in a nutshell, a really dramatic decline and deterioration of working and livelihood conditions for workers during the pandemic. This has included falling incomes. It's included unpaid severance in the face of layoffs. It's included skyrocketing debt levels, depletion of savings, worsening working conditions, and that these impacts are playing out along gendered, racialized, age-based lines, especially, as well as other markers of social difference. But women, racial and ethnic minorities have been hit the hardest here. Most workers in our study reported that their diminished incomes was forcing a reduction of the amount of food that they were consuming each day, and especially where workers had dependent children, most, upwards of 80 to 90%, were skipping meals in the pandemic to try to feed their children and to try to keep some food coming in. They often were also incurring debts with very high interest rates, often to buy food or to access desperately needed medical care during the pandemic. So I think the point here is really twofold. One is that the growing desperation amongst women, LGBTQ, migrant, and other groups of workers is pushing them into a downward spiral of degraded working conditions and heightening their vulnerability to indicators of forced labor. And we see that as being a long-term issue that there's really no relief in sight from, because people have taken on such high levels of debt during the pandemic that they're now needing to pay off. And the only route to paying these off is, again, through this, devalued low-wage labor. And secondly, that we see kind of intersectingly, this isn't just about degrading conditions in the immediate term, though those are, vitally important. And it's been horrific, really, to see what has happened to the workers in our study over the course of the pandemic in terms of basic things like food and nutrition, especially. But it's also about the longer term here, because we're seeing that the pandemic is really accelerating and amplifying longstanding inequities within and surrounding supply chains. So it's devaluing many different types of labor. And this includes this low-wage labor in supply chains. So just to wrap up, thinking of the theme of the panel, feminists have argued for such a long time that when people study the economy in ways that focus very narrowly on production and exchange, and don't include the reproductive duties and realm, then it introduces biases into how the economy is understood and to the policy responses to it. And those biases are gendered. And I think that here we see, this happening. Well, we see a challenge to that trend in the sense that suddenly everyone from, major media outlets to non-feminist political economists in our field have really taken note of these issues. But it remains to be seen, I think, whether people will fundamentally integrate these learnings into the way that they understand the building blocks of the economy. And so far, I haven't come across many reasons for optimism that where we think about value and labor, that those kind of big fundamental shifts in how our thinking should evolve have taken place. But maybe the other panelists have more optimism to share. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Genevieve. Wow, that's a great place to start. And so now we will have a quick commentary response from Shirin, around 2-3 minutes.
Yeah, I knowing your work so well, Genevieve, I was also curious about something that I noticed during the first lockdown, which was that as the demand for the supply chain related labor sort of, hubs collapsed, especially in the global South. And as the governments were quite differently addressing this problem that was emerging in front of us, there was a huge also increase in burden because of the lockdowns that were imposed very suddenly. And I don't know whether you remember in the first lockdown, there was this huge reportage of what was happening in India at the time, which was basically people returning from urban centers of employment to rural areas where they felt more safe, where their families were, and also because they were just thrown out sort of, on the scrap heap of labor, within days. So they had no place because everything was connected to being employed in these factories. And what I've started thinking about is that, there was a lot of focus on these returnees and the travails of return, but very little on the increase in socially productive work that their families had to undergo, and almost no support for them at all as to how do you manage increased levels of socially productive work and decreased incomes, radically decreased incomes. And so I think that, yes, of course, sort of, the debt is a really important area in this context. But as you've said already, these were gendered, but they were also classed, they were also sort of raced. And in the context of India that I was talking about, caste played a huge role. So who goes last, as in terms of unemployment, and who goes first? What are the conditions of employment which are already bad? And then when you get out, who supports you and who doesn't? And what does the government, which is also raced and classed and gendered, etc. So I think that you've raised some really interesting questions. And sadly, I wish I could say I'm more optimistic than you, but perhaps not.
Thank you, Shirin. We will see if someone can cheer us up. Okay, excellent. And so we are moving on now to Lisa, Elizabeth Poole.
Yes, thanks a lot, Jackie. And I'm also really, really thrilled to be here. And I feel a little intimidated by being among so many smart women. But I'll do my best. And I wanted to start off my remarks actually by thinking about the today. What you, in your question, you asked about the understanding of the global economy today and what feminist political economy can bring to that. In my understanding, this today is actually a today of multiple crises, and the crises have Genevieve has addressed some of this. There's, of course, the health crisis with the pandemic, but also the associated underinvestment in the health sector that has become visible through it. But there's also an ecological crisis going on, a climate crisis, the capitalism self-devouring it through its focus on growth. And I'm glad, Genevieve, you talked about hunger. I think there is a massive economic crisis going on because of the unequal impacts of all of this that has also involved large-scale job losses in the services sector in particular, as you say, but also especially in the South. And we are now in a phase where we actually have, again, food prices at levels that were last seen in 2006, 2007, and you may remember the amount of food insecurity and disarray that sowed all over the world. So what is it that feminist political economy can contribute to understanding this? Of course, one can enter that question in all kinds of different ways. And since I'm just teaching this semester of feminist theory, I happened to reread Nancy Hartzog last week about the feminist standpoint and abstract masculinity. So I'm going to use that entry point. And what Hartzog tells us is that knowledge, and I think feminist political economy is actually a kind of knowledge. Knowledge is derived from everyday experience, and she insists that there is differential male and female life activities that lead to different kinds of knowledge. On the one hand, potentially feminist standpoint, but on the other hand, abstract masculinity as male experience is, I'm very simplifying this, attaches little value to what happens in the sphere of the family, and so therefore establishes this duality between the abstract and the concrete. And masculinity then becomes an abstract ideal that needs to be achieved in opposition to daily life. And Hartzog tells us that this is what founds the problem of women's subordination and the destruction of nature. So I think these two crises, I think, need to be seen in a connected way, and Hartzog already indicated this. The duality between the concrete and the abstract, if it anchors masculine knowledge, I think that one of those key abstractions is the exchange abstraction. So abstract masculinity, one can argue, anchors the capitalist economy, which after all is based on being constituted by a body of knowledge that we call economics, a discipline that thrives on abstract rules, that sees the free markets as guided by abstract rules. And I would include in this development economics with its pursuit of abstract growth, founding the violence and neo-imperialism of various forms of contemporary extractivism. I also would add the idea of globalized markets, where a geography is mostly distances to be conquered and the friction of the material as something to be overcome. So forgotten is the concreteness of the material, the concreteness of markets, actually. And what I think feminists and Hartzog also have emphasized, in particular, the dependency of human beings on each other, our need for care, our dependency on Earth for nourishment, our animal nature, and our necessity of living in harmony with Earth. So I would like to think of feminism and feminist political economy and feminist ecology actually as something that also refigures ontologies. as something that contributes to understanding the crisis by redefining the problem as one anchored in abstract masculinity. And there's a beautiful, just recent special issue actually of Nouvelle Question Feminist, which suggests that we should really be thinking of the Anthropocene as an androcene. Feminist economics specifically, of course, also tells us that we need to change understanding of what the economy is, and in particular what the economy is for. And so we have various suggestions about provisioning, about the production of life and social reproduction, but also about the flourishing of humans and Earth. And I think this comes out of ecofeminism. Care, of course, is central to these purposes, and I will not expand on that because I don't have time, but I would like to say 2 words on on the implication of all of this for policy changes. There's a lot of promising news out there. UN Women just put out a report, a feminist plan actually for sustainability and social justice beyond COVID-19 that highlights things such as public investments in the care economy, renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and so on. There's, I think, in the various investments that governments in the North have done with regard to rebuilding after COVID-19, a lot of very promising line items, including the US government plan that also talks about the care economy. In Switzerland, we just passed a referendum in favor of supporting nurses. So care seems to be going around. Yet, and I'm not particularly optimistic here either, not on this count in any way, gender and care overall is not salient in these policies. Indeed, UN Women and UNDP, their COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker shows that only about 15% of total fiscal and economic response has been gender sensitive, but maybe more importantly, there's massive global inequalities between countries, and what this tracker also calls a yawning stimulus gap between high and low income countries. Indeed, the IMF tells us that budget cuts are expected in 154 countries in 2021 and in 159 countries in 2022, with an expectation of austerity and a draining of finances from education and healthcare. And of course, this is exactly the opposite policy as that pursued in the North. There is also vaccine apartheid. And so as a result, I think something that just underlies these massive inequalities. I will stop here because I don't want to overdo my time, and I will save the rest for question and answers.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, another wonderful contribution to this conversation. Okay, Catherine has a couple of minutes to respond, reflect, comment.
No, thank you so much. It's terrific to be here today, and that was very thought-provoking. I was not expecting to hear about standpoint theory. I'm sort of considering how, and it's so relevant, right? I am really struck certainly by the observations that Elizabeth brought to bear around how this moment really has been a window where that tension and the visceral tension between the everyday and life and people's experience have butted up, certainly against established neoliberal theory. Really challenged them in a way, cracked open, created openings into, obviously, very, established hegemonic ways of thinking about the economy, about austerity, about the relationships between capital and labor. This has been a really fluid moment, and the hope that's attached to that is this profound challenge is. COVID's been called the great revealer, but I mean, obviously those of us here would acknowledge that racism and patriarchy and ableism obviously are deeply entrenched. What it has done, it's, these are obviously longstanding disparities. What COVID's done is revealed the way that these things are baked into our institutions, into our economy. I think the insight about the tension between people's lived experiences and the reality, how that's played out in COVID, is really powerful, and how that's playing out in different policy realms right now. My own experience is about Canada, so I'm listening to the observations from my colleagues around the international realm in different countries, and I completely agree. I think the experience elsewhere has been really, profoundly disturbing. I think certainly that COVID is deepening as a moment, is deepening inequities in a wrong variety of ways. Here in Canada, I think there's an interesting moment where we have nominally a feminist federal government, and we have a business community that is on, we have bank economists publishing regularly on inclusive growth. We have this odd disconnect between what marginalized communities have experienced during the pandemic and what our elites are saying, and whether there's a moment now as to whether we actually have an opportunity to make some of the profound changes that feminist political economy obviously have been calling us to. I know that Elizabeth writes on this kind of theme. I'm not particularly optimistic. I'll speak to that in my own comments, but I think this disconnect, this moment, what's needed to push real reform, whether it's at the UN, whether it's in international agencies, groups like the IMF, what's going on here in Canada in terms of policy, it's really pressing. And it speaks to power and whether we've actually shifted power in the relations of power. And I actually don't think we have. But I'll come back and thank you again, Elizabeth, for those observations and making me think about that in a new way. So thanks.
Wonderful. Yes, I'm glad that someone said power too. This is a good concept to be pointing to at this moment. Okay, Sharon, now you have the stage. I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jackie, and thank you for inviting us and putting this panel together. I think we have already said that there's sort of, we are doing this standing on the shoulders of giants. Two of them are in the audience, Spike Peterson and Rianne Mahan. So it is lovely to be here and to participate in this roundtable. So I've been working on the issue of care and depletion through social reproduction for many years now, and have seen the care policy landscape in the UK, but also in other parts of the world, being under scrutiny for years. And I must say that to be positive about outcomes of the legacy of the pandemic seems a little bit of a stretch. And what I want to say today is just a couple of things. First, that epistemic hegemony means that feminist insights are not either heard or are overlooked or are not integrated or sort of, are just not sort of, integrated into policy. And secondly, that there is another epistemic hierarchy, which actually feminists need to address more themselves. And that is something that both Genevieve and Lisa have referred to, which is on grounds of race and on counts of global North and global South disparities. So unless we are able to address these two, and one is more in our hands than the other, I would suggest it's going to be difficult to be optimistic. As you have already said, and Genevieve and Lisa have also mentioned, the COVID pandemic has yet again underlined the importance of care. So the valuing of care, however, remains elusive as women continue to be made more vulnerable to this crisis. In part, of course, it is, we know, because of the gendered regimes of paid labor, which see women as disproportionate number of care workers. So 70.4% of the total workforce in the health and social work sectors are women. I think many of us felt first quite moved, but then quite angry in the UK when we started clapping for carers It was not just in the UK, but in the Netherlands and in India, they started bagging pots to support these care workers who are mostly women. But that did not make up for low rates of pay, poor health infrastructure, conditions of work, which deteriorated sharply during this period, and the gender and race inequalities that mark the lives of these carers. So the crisis of health that this virus has revealed has also been a familial crisis. COVID-19 induced lockdowns resulted in sharp increases in care labor at home. Children had to be home taught as schools closed down. Family members stayed at home and had to be fed. More people at home generated more cleaning work and domestic labor. The International Labour Organization calculates that on average, women around the world performed 4 hours and 25 minutes of unpaid care labor every day, compared with 1 hour and 23 minutes for men. So lockdowns have also increased. I think there was a big report by Oxfam, domestic violence by up to 30% in many countries. We also know in the recent report that has come out in the UK that child abuse has increased and violence against children, violence against the elderly. What we've also seen in the UK has been a really racialized COVID discourse by the government itself, when there was a lot of talk, especially at this beginning, that somehow the transmissibility of COVID was due to the irresponsible traveling of people from the global south to the global north. B, that somehow Black and ethnic minority communities were more vulnerable to COVID and therefore were spreaders of COVID. Which of course then also generated a lot of anger. And I'm just reading transcripts of interviews that have been done in Coventry, that I'm part of this project, where people have actually been racially abused in their everyday lives because of this discourse around Black and ethnic minority people and COVID. But of course, as Lisa already pointed out, the pandemic is not the only crisis that's facing us. Climate crisis is another one. And feminists have been arguing, and my whole sort of concept of depletion through social reproduction, which I developed with my wonderful friend and colleague, Catherine Hoskins and Dania Thomas, is an environmental concept, which is that we got from environmental depletion. So feminists have been arguing that, like environmental depletion, depletion through social reproduction should be also be visibilized as cost to development. And all this current talk, because in the UK we've had a lot of this because of the COP26 about new Green Deals, also overlooks the gendered analysis to climate change, that care jobs are low carbon, and in low carbon jobs and investment in these jobs would help reduce carbon emissions, that militarization of our economies cannot be acceptable when during COP26 we discuss carbon emission reduction strategies without taking those into account, that mining for energies and technologies and growth of biofuels displace people, communities, and destroy lives, and increase social reproductive burdens and violence against communities. And ultimately, something that we all agree as feminists, I think, that GDP-based growth analyses cannot address transformation of an unequal global society. So crises such as the pandemics are also moments, I would suggest, both of urgency and openness. And that's where your there are liminal moments when change becomes possible for short periods. And because of this, as Stevano et al. Have argued, the transformative potential of the crisis can be harnessed by framing policy and political responses around, but it needs to be done around social reproduction and its essential contributions to work and life. However, far from developing policies for a caring societies, I think we are living in a careless society, one that depends on care but does not value the doing of care. The cost of this carelessness is heavy and is paid by society as a whole, but of course, as we know, more by women, reflecting their disproportionate contribution to household and care labor. The pandemic has resulted not in transformations, but I would suggest consolidations of gendered regimes of labor, increased pressures of performing this labor, and therefore increased depletion of individual and social lives. So this appropriation of reproductive labor, of course, I've also already suggested this, is also racialized, right? Black bodies are harnessed to precarious and unsafe arenas of poorly paid work that makes them vulnerable to disease. And this has been very clear in the UK, how many more Black and ethnic minority proportionally people have died as a result of poor structural positioning within society. Feminist work has long argued that social reproduction is a central but unacknowledged source of accumulation under capitalism, which, if not addressed urgently, has direct consequences for depletion of human lives and capabilities. And yet it continues to be a willful refusal, it seems to me, to acknowledge this work, its value, and the harm its non-recognition causes every day. Gargi Bhattacharya has pointed to the myth of expendability attached to race, that of peoples and regions and landscapes, that racialized people and regions are thus more disposable, more depleted, and made expendable. And despite the BLM, etc., my research shows that this expendability and discursive violence continues. So what is it? Are we being overlooked because people just don't know about the work that feminists are doing? Obviously not, because this has now been in the public domain for so long. As Bess points out, the practical role of ignorance in economic policy making, ranging from wishful thinking to confusion, fudging, denial, and puzzling, which then allows, I think, makers to discount political effects of their economic actions, is one reason why policy change, I think, has not happened. These unknowers, one could argue, are generative of a careless society. And Muller has argued in her work on carelessness that the status of care in capitalist societies results actually in value abjection of both care work and those that perform this labor. It's a beautiful little piece, The Careless Society, Dependency and Care Work in Capitalist Societies, which she wrote in 2019. And I think we can extend this approach to conceptually conflate carelessness as overlooking, careless, as well as willful structural disregard, care-less, that is supported by the state. And so Raminder Kaur and I have just written a short blog in which we argue that policy leaders, that carelessness includes the carelessness of policy leaders and reproduction of privilege. It undervalues care labor, it marginalizes people of minority, racial, or ethnic minorities, and it sort of also underpins the lack of investment in social infrastructure. And what is, of course, difficult just now for us in terms of is that right-wing populism, which I'm seeing at least both in the UK and in India just now, are mutating variants which refuse to take notice of all this evidence. I have to wrap up and I will stop here now. Sorry about this, Jackie, I didn't see your comment.
Okay, no, it was wonderful. And you even preempted a question I was going to ask. I can't ask now. So you did the question of why is it we see this evidence and we aren't acting? So that's one possible, yeah, great theory. The concept of carelessness is great. Okay, Elizabeth now has a chance to comment.
Gosh, where to start? This is so rich. This is so sure. This is, I mean, I love that you also started out with the notion of epistemic hegemony, because I do think that that is really, really central in the politics that we are encountering, and bringing care in, and what care does, and how care is and isn't valued, and then ultimately carelessness, I think is I'd like to actually have more of a discussion maybe in this group about that also, as to what we mean by care. Because on the one hand, clearly it's labor, and so social reproduction approaches also tell us it is labor, but it strikes me that it's more than that, because it also involves a particular way of being. You know, this is kind of going back to Hartzog a little bit again, a particular identity that we are establishing, or selves that are connected, selves that are not self-contained, but in different ways connect to the world. I'm glad also you talked about domestic violence, Shirin. One of the really interesting things that I also saw in these UN women's statistics, you can see that I looked at the report, is that when governments in those packages, recovery packages, did include gender considerations, it was in order to address violence against women, because I mean, that was obviously out there, but apparently that's easier to do than actually addressing the care economy or making political economy a topic. So protection is always easier for the patriarchy than other things. Depletion, of course, yeah. I mean, this is such an important concept that you guys contributed, and it certainly was a mind shifter for me when I read that article. I was like, wow, yeah, of course, right? I mean, it did, and it's interesting to me also how the relationship to the earth and kind of the ecological crisis, how tightly it's interwoven with the care crisis, because of the kind of knowledge that informs you know, the economy, the structuring of the economy, but also the way we relate to nature. Those things are entirely connected. And yeah, carelessness, I guess we have to have a new Shirin Ray concept that we are gonna have to take, and I love it. I have to look for the blog. Finally, well, you didn't get to talk about right-wing populism, but I'd like you to talk about that more afterwards. And we have to talk about politics more. So I hope, Jackie, you're going to remind us of that.
Thank you. Excellent. And I will also remind our audience that you may, if you want to start throwing questions into the Q&A section, we have one more speaker and comment, but if people want to start reflecting on questions, we can get that going afterwards. So I'm now going to turn it over to Catherine.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and thanks to all. This has been such a tremendous opportunity, hugely rich contributions so far. I'm going to shift gears a bit. I'm really struck with how eloquently everyone has been speaking about, obviously, the moment, the current crisis, and its disproportionate impact on marginalized communities, and in particular on marginalized women, certainly around the world and here in Canada. I'm at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and we're a think tank, and I'm based in Ottawa. Our national office is actually across the country, but our national office is here in Ottawa, and we've been spent effectively the last 20 months in crisis mode, trying to respond, to the fire hose of information, like what was happening, trying to capture the moment, trying to raise the profound questions around who is being impacted, who is carrying the burden of this crisis, who, what are our policy responses up to the mark? Are they capturing, are they supporting those most in need? And, it's been this really, in effect, traumatic sort of experience to look at the ways in which our inequalities have so profoundly structured our institutions. I said at the onset that COVID's been called the great revealer, but of course there was no mystery about the impact of ableism when we saw such high, certainly in Canada, the highest rates, some of the highest rates in the world of deaths of vulnerable seniors in long-term care homes. When we saw the impact of higher illness and rates in racialized communities in Toronto and all our major centers, all of that information came forward. So again, no surprise, we've spoken about that. I would also say it's been an opportunity to look at, obviously COVID's revealed the, profound flaws in our social security systems and our income security net. And that's been a really particular of concern to us, and looking at how Canada has responded. Certainly for its part, the federal government, and sort of speaking a bit about the response, and then I want to segue into the discussion of feminist political economy, what happened in Canada. The federal government largely concentrated its efforts on providing financial resources to stabilize financial markets and household incomes. And they did that through a variety of things, certainly direct measures targeting businesses and individuals, as well as transfers to the provinces and territories, to support schools, certainly healthcare, acquisition of PPE and the like. The scale of Canada's contribution was actually quite significant from the federal government. Last year in 2020, it represented almost 15% of GDP. It was a massive increase. And what was interesting in Canada was that a lot of the focus, as compared to other countries, in Canada, there was a significant portion of money that actually was directed to individual households. And so the federal government played a significant role in offsetting and mitigating the financial impact of the crisis on low-income households and marginalized people, those actually who had experienced employment. Missed a whole lot of things. I'll come to that in a minute. But, had it not been for the actions of the federal state, the Stats Canada estimates the rate of poverty based on market incomes would have been 40%. Like, that's extraordinary. It would have been 40%. As it was, it drove down poverty rates. And so we look at that and the impact and the role and what the moment revealed about the graphic flaws in our income security net. Who benefited from that? Marginalized communities, women and the like. Groups like lone parent families who still, even as this past summer, were working 50% less hours. Like, it was extraordinary, the impact of this crisis on lone parent families, which is not occasioned much comment, precisely because of the structure of their lives and the disproportionate impact of work on them. So the federal government played a really important role. But at the same time, in Canada, of course, we're federal state, what was going on in the provinces and territories was a wholly different kettle of fish. And we saw really graphic disparities revealed, certainly the result of an imbalance between jurisdictions. We saw mixed messaging, certainly around COVID and the programs that were revealed. Canada's decades of neglect and privatization of our public services, all of which were laid bare. And I would say the gender bias, profoundly deep-seated gender bias, certainly in particularly evident in some jurisdictions more than others, assumed that women would just get on with it. Like, the profound absence of even any consideration of what it meant just to sort of bring a lockdown, introduce a unnecessary public health lockdown without actually then turning your attention to like what that would mean for families, literally. And so we saw, at the height of the pandemic, mothers were 10 times more likely to leave the labor force than fathers were. And that was true with every successive wave. We see that in the labor market data. It was quite clear. So women were truly the real economic shock absorbers of this and occasioned. What's been interesting in the current moment, and I want to talk a bit about, we can talk about how, the different policies and what different governments did. But what's really striking is we've been having that conversation in Canada about what that meant. So we have a feminist finance minister who made it certainly part of her mandate to bring in and has introduced a historic investment in childcare. A lot of the discourse around that was precisely around the crisis. We now have a Women in Economy Task Force in Canada. We have gender-based plus analysis that was introduced with all of the major federal, let me be clear, this is federal policy statements in our budget and the recovery plan, all of which had an intersectional analysis attached to them. And it's really an extraordinary moment. And as I mentioned earlier, we see as well, even among the releases from the major banks in Canada, major economic players, Conference Board, all of whom are talking now about the importance of inclusive growth, precisely because, we've had this past year. And as to whether that actually is the moment and leverages change, that becomes a question. What is the power? Because at the same time, we have provincial governments, and I can speak certainly here in Ontario, I'm based in Ottawa, our provincial government is in the process of awarding 30-year contracts to for-profit long-term care providers, precisely the same care providers that were responsible for such high death rates in our case. So no change at all. So we're talking about missing a beat, not at all. We have a province like Quebec gearing up again, looking at massive shortages in caring industries, looking and lobbying the federal government to expand our temporary worker program in order to bring in and facilitate the entry of more migrant care workers, temporary migrant care workers under our temporary worker program, which obviously, puts all of those workers at a massive disadvantage because they do not enjoy the same employment rights as other Canadian-born, Canadian-based workers. So we have provincial governments moving quickly to tap expendable sources of global labor to help fill our care gaps. We have, as well, I think, the disconnect as well between provinces, and I mentioned this massive potential investment in childcare, but some provinces, of course, hanging back. Ontario, Alberta has just kicking and screaming, addressing these massive, the capacity gaps in our largely privatized market of childcare services. And yet still unclear as to whether those investments will be made, whether direct investments will be directed actually to nonprofit or public service, even given the experiences we've had this year. So we have this, I would say in Canada, certainly a language, the discourse has been certainly highlighted and focused on the disproportionate impact, yet on the ground, what's happening certainly reinforces these are old patterns. So whether by design or default, are we reverting to same old, same old? And, that speaks to the power. Have we shifted the power dynamics? Has this crisis really facilitated that awakening, that disconnect between policy leaders? So it's a good opportunity to have this discussion because Canada's held up internationally. And I see this at UN Women. You see all these track records. They're quite keen to get Trudeau to come and do his shtick. We're held up as sort of progressive, and yet when you actually see what's going on the ground, what have we learned? Are we learning the lessons of COVID? Will we be reforming our EI system, which massively failed workers? That's not clear. So I think, the rubber hasn't hit the road yet. And some hope not. I guess I'm a bit cynical these days. Seems a bit hard. I think we're all tired. We're all wrung out, but yet we're the privileged few that actually are sitting on the better other side of the pandemic. Many others continue. I was struck even this past week, and I'll end up here. I'm sort of, I was reading reviews on, because obviously inflation, increase in food prices, of course, having a massive impact. We've seen in Canada, they've just released the hunger count this year with an increased number of precarity of families, huge increase of seniors accessing food banks. And yet in our newspapers, with the November jobs report, there's a suggestion that Canada, we're done. The recovery has been achieved. And in fact, we may actually be on the cusp of full employment, which is driving massive wage increases. That's actually not true. And it's really time for the federal, the Bank of Canada to get serious and rise, jack up interest rates, which precipitate actually a long-term, which lay the ground obviously for further austerity and devastation. So, even this past week, we're starting to hear those voices, which certainly tells me neoliberalism has not released its grasp from the institutions of policy and the major centers of economic power in Canada. So hopefully I'll leave it there, and hopefully we can take up some of these questions in the discussion.
Thank you. Wonderful. And I like that link back to these questions of neoliberalism. And any talk in the Bank of Canada, which I work on these days, I'm also great. Okay, Genevieve, you are our last commenter. If you wanted to have a couple of minutes to comment on Catherine.
Sure, I'd be honored to. Catherine, what interesting comments, and really, I think, nicely tying together some of the themes that came up throughout the other contributions so far. So thank you so much for those. Two things really stuck out to me about what you said that seem important to note as we sort of move into the conversational Q&A part of the discussion. One was around the economic shock absorption function of women and other groups during the pandemic. And I think, the statistics you provided and some of the data from the Canadian perspective on that are just so stark. And we see that also in many other places in the world, that, the default has sort of been in all sorts of multifaceted ways for women to absorb all of the shock, income shock, hunger shock, many different types of shock related to this pandemic. And, as you said at the end there, people are tired, like, where is this going to go, and how are the impacts of that going to be mitigated or addressed over time as we start to come out of this pandemic? What are some of the key questions there that what does that look like in terms of the economic shock function going forward? And the second, I think, what really stood out to me and what you were saying is you're underscoring so beautifully the ways in which people's access to safety nets and to entitlements around, income and that sort of thing during the pandemic has been so deeply shaped by their relationship to states. We see, as you said, that in Canada, if you are a citizen or a person who has a state-based entitlement, there has been a degree of being able to weather the pandemic and keep food on the table, even while, staying at home in some circumstances, or not being able to have the income that you would typically rely on. And yet, at the same time, thinking about some of what Sharon mentioned around race, and I would add there, migration status. In many places, there have been huge populations within these countries who haven't been entitled to those forms of relief during the pandemic, or haven't been able to access it due to different forms of discrimination. And so I'm curious, if you could say more, if you have an opportunity to, about what that's looked like in Canada and who hasn't been able to access, these important forms of provisioning that you mentioned. And then I guess for our discussion as we move in, the one thing that strikes me that's really important here is, fundamentally, we're looking at the politics of whether and to what extent some of those forms of provisioning will be able to continue. As many people have said on the panel, this is about, some of what's happened in Canada and other places are things that feminists have been saying should just be part of how governments function and support the population generally. And I'm curious if people have thoughts about, how will this be paid for, or what will it look like? Kind of what are the politics of that fight beyond the pandemic? And also thinking about the kind of environmental displacements and the things that are going on. The displaced and becoming increasingly stateless populations, it strikes me will have a more difficult time if state-based entitlement becomes the way forward through shocks and crises. What does that look like for people who are displaced from states or don't have access to state-based entitlement for various reasons, because they're migrant workers or because of environmental crisis or whatever else? I'd like, to hear from others, if we have time in the discussion, a little bit more about what they're thinking on those themes. Thank you.
Wonderful. Oh my goodness, some great questions there. So we've got about 25 minutes now. So for questions, which I think is good. And I'm going to encourage our audience to please, I've got a few questions to start us off, which is great, but do please feel free to write your comments and questions, and I will get to as many of them as possible. We've got a couple I'm going to sort of group together around, I think, starting to flag some of these questions around politics, which I think is excellent. And so I've got from Diana, the Alejandra Flores Echevarria. The arguments of populist government should the arguments of populist governments be considered as careless or disregarding of women's situation? So thinking a bit about populism, which I think was thrown in, and thinking the particularities and the varieties of populism we can think of. She gives the example here, thinking about the Mexican president who on the one hand declared he would work against gender violence, but at the same time declared that emergency calls were fake or raise questions about this. So this sort of, again, some of these, you were talking about the sort of complex, the sort of comfort with protection on the one hand, but not thinking sort of more profound ways about forms of gender inequality. And Laura McDonald Thanks to everyone for their wonderful comments. So far, speakers haven't talked about responses from women's movements or labor movements or racialized groups. Shirin, I think, did mention Black Lives Matter. Can someone address how social movements have responded to the crises or can respond in the future, given that protests have been constrained by the risks of the pandemic to some extent? So those are two really interesting ways of thinking about forms of politics and the limits and the challenges of politics in the present moment. So I don't know if a few people wanted to jump in. It's not necessarily for everyone, but if a couple of people wanted to jump in on that, that would be great.
So given that I raised the issue of populism, maybe I can jump in on that. I mean, I think that that's an important question. And I feel that whether it is left populism or right populism, there is a big difference between the two. So I don't want to conflate them at all. But at the same time, there is that sense of, on the one hand, to go back to Lisa's comments, sort of, you know, a particular kind of masculinity at operation, right? Which is about protecting women, but linking that to a masculinized nationalism. So very often it becomes protecting women and protecting the nation, and protecting the nation under COVID times, as we know from the global north, has become about hoarding all the vaccines you can and not sort of allowing others to do so, to have access. And in countries like India, where populism is sort of very strong right now, a populist regime is very strong right now, it becomes almost a masculinized discourse about nothing can harm us because we are so great. And so in a way, I just think that it's an important question. I want to look at it, but also there's the key theme in both sort of countries here, the UK and India in this context in terms of populism, which is boosterism. So, you know, everything is fine. You know, the way it is, it's absolutely fine if only we could get more COVID sort of vaccines, or if we could just have this or that, and we will sort it. And so I think in a way, it is important to link those. I mean, I think that this panel, for me anyways, has allowed me to link through some of these issues, the questions that, you know, Genevieve started with, and then Lisa picked up on, then Catherine. So I think we are trying to figure it out between ourselves and among ourselves. And I suppose that is because ultimately, even though I'm the EO of my family and my friends, because I can never think that there's an optimistic outcome of this, but I think it's also important for us to know, and that just links up with Laura's question about social movements, because we cannot be too down on it either. If we don't have the what should I call? I think it was Giro, wasn't he? He called about it sort of, you know, he said that action militates against the sheer weight of the apocalypse. And we need to do that, because otherwise, what is there? I mean, you know, we can all just get so deflated that politics is left to these boosterist and populist leaders. So I think that there have been, and BLM was obviously one big intervention and during the COVID period, but it's also true to say that the lack of space and the rise of populism has actually undermined many of these movements. But I don't work in this area, so I let others answer that question.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to jump in on? I actually am going to add one question on this question of I've got a question here that I think links up with this question of social movements, where we have Christine Shaver asking, how can marginalized groups in the lower class be united to come together and fight for better access to resources as one large group rather than specialized smaller groups? Which is, again, thinking through these questions of protest but also mobilization and difference and solidarity and their various tensions. So I'll just throw that into the mix. Does someone want to reflect? Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'll be able to answer any of these questions particularly well, but I did want to talk about politics and some of the things that have been going around my mind on this and just see what people think about, get their take on whether this makes any sense. One of the things that really I think was striking in the early days of the lockdown is how much solidarity there was. And it was, it was at a very, very local level. So people going shopping for other people, people bringing them medicines. You had domestic violence shelters that stayed open. I mean, it's the local farmers, and here in Geneva, it was all of them. They stepped up, and they were required to step up in order to just ensure the food security of the population. And so there was a sense of exception that actually was really inspiring in many ways. And as much as the clapping was silly, I mean, it was part of that general sense of that something needed to be done and could be done, and that people could act together. And in that context, in the sense that everything that ultimately we'll be doing where we make a change is going to be local. I've been kind of inspired by the work of Davina Cooper when she talks about the plural state and how we tend to, when we think about the state, we usually think about it as the nation state. When the state is such a disaggregated thing, can put it that way, not only in the sense of Catherine talked about the provinces and so on, and of course we also have the local municipalities that engage in very different kinds of politics, and one could push it even further to think about all kinds of institutions as places where rulemaking is happening, and where rules are being changed, and where power is being negotiated. And so, to the extent that I think there's a lot more going on in those local situations, and I'd like to connect that also to Catherine Gibson-Graham's work on teasing out the more than capitalist economy, to just highlighting also these many forms of doing the economy differently, and celebrating that and making that visible because it exists. And when we talk about care, we are talking about one of those elements that is a very basic practice of solidarity that shows all kinds of different expressions in local contexts. And so, in a sense, and I'm going back to Cooper again, and she talks about prefigurative politics, about performing life as it is wished for, rather than thinking about the utopia that we know we can get to. In a sense, it's very political to do these things, to engage in those solidarity actions, but also in caring. It's a very political thing. And so maybe that's the element where I might be optimistic rather than pessimistic. I think if we don't think about changing the whole world immediately, but think about local politics and the way in which we can, Miriam Tola calls it, reclaim the public. She was talking about the municipality in Milan during the crisis, and you remember how bad that was in Lombardy. They basically, had people called in for help on various things, and they had just given up on it, and they just sent people on to the various solidarity emergency phone lines that have been set up by volunteers. So there was a different politics that emerged in the context of the crisis, but this reclaiming of the public, I think, is maybe a way to think about what lower class, how lower class can unite, or these questions of how movements might become active. I'd be curious to see what people think about that.
Thank you. Did anyone want to jump in on this point? Yeah, Catherine.
I'm thinking about the question of social movements and what's happened in the experience over the last number of months. And certainly, I mean, I think in Canada, right before COVID rose, before March 2020, there was a huge increase. There were confrontations between Indigenous communities and nations and federal government, certainly on the West Coast. You know, an articulation, a growing movement around decolonization, and all of you know, that was really present in the movement. Obviously, Black Lives Matter, the huge protests this previous summer, and all of that was consumed by the pandemic. And it's interesting where that energy, because my thought, certainly that energy shifted gears, but it was still very present in local communities, whether it was supporting like mutual aid networks that sprang up across the country, like in places like Hamilton. This is obviously what Elizabeth was talking about. You saw the labor community mobilizing on a variety of ways to protect workers' rights and to articulate. We still see that different groups of unions, obviously representing hospitality workers, those like Unifor representing steel workers in manufacturing, the Canadian Labour Congress, very, very active, putting forward and pushing aggressively for paid sick leave, which was such a travesty in Canada, where workers literally still and continue not to have paid sick leave so that they can leave. And that was really disproportionately impacted migrant workers in particular, who went to work ill and became, you know, it just started that spiral. So I do think that this was a moment where different communities came. I'm not sure whether we see that kind of whether completely the different groups necessarily. I think there was a lot of solidarity, but did that transform into a coalescence? That's not a word. Of you know, sort of more popular energy to make more profound changes, to mobilize the community resources and the political activism that's necessary to facilitate more structural change. I'm not sure where that placed, but I do think communities were very active. It's at that moment, like what are the, you know, the pressure is on around picking political priorities, making changes like childcare, to go hard on labor reform, any number of big policies. Do you focus on what's going on provincially? Because a lot of there's a lot of regressive things that are queuing up as provinces use the pretext of the pandemic to start to introduce austerity agendas, which, you know, we're already seeing that. So it's I think it's complex. So not wholly cynical, but I don't think there hasn't been, I don't think, a coming together that would necessarily, or in a clearly articulated progressive vision that people are mobilizing behind at this juncture.
Thank you. That's so interesting, thinking of the sort of two sides of moments of exception and crisis, that they can be moments for doing good things, but they can also be moments for changing the game in ways that can be very regressive as well, which is certainly we saw in 2008. So it'll be interesting to see whether we see the same shift to austerity. I have a couple of questions here, actually specifically on migrant labor. So I think, or actually on domestic labor. I'm going to just ask those two. From Prince Owusu, how do we make sense of the gender, race, and class implications of the over-reliance and exploitation of migrant labor during COVID, especially in long-term residential care? Catherine talked a bit about the Canadian context, and Shirin mentioned expendability and disposability. I'm wondering if they have any further thoughts. And from Kumudi, I would like to hear from Dr. Shirin about domestic workers who provide care work to most middle and upper middle class households in the Indian context and fall under the unorganized sector. So two questions kind of exploring the politics and the political economy of domestic workers and their sort of intersectional dynamics. I don't know if either both of you wanted to jump in on that.
Yeah, I mean, you can come at the question of domestic work from so many different angles, and it's difficult to summarize. But I think in the context of COVID, we, at least in India, we saw two major trends, I would say. One is people leaving employment, as I said already, and therefore becoming themselves and also their families much more vulnerable to exploitation, but also obviously to issues that we have been discussing about social reproduction, hunger, lack of resources, etc. And others who remained in employment but were unable to or they were very restricted in the way in which, and they became the buffer between the virus, it seemed to me, and their employers. So they are the ones who went out to do the shopping every day. They went to get the milk. They sort of, all that stuff of everyday life, which is already kind of, they did under conditions of COVID. And so, but when they became infected, as they inevitably would, if you are in the, especially in the first period, then what happens? So the health infrastructure is really poor. Their conditions of work are precarious. And then they have this sort of, illness, which is transmissible. And so their employers at that stage would not want to care for them. So in a way, I think that conditions of work, which have already been for domestic labor in India, are very precarious and not good, become dreadful under both those circumstances. And I think that what we have seen is, of course, sort of, some mobilization of domestic workers, but mobilizing domestic workers is so difficult. I mean, I think Rianne is here and she's done some work on this. It's such a difficult thing to do, but also in times of crisis, it is such a difficult thing to do. So I don't know what more to say about this just now, but I think that conditions of under COVID, conditions of domestic workers haven't improved at all.
Thank you. Catherine.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I don't think the conditions for domestic workers, so we're talking about migrant domestic workers, certainly in Canada, I don't think they've improved. We do actually have number of coalitions across the country of domestic workers and migrant workers. Certainly there's a large one in Toronto, and there's a great report, the name of which is out of my head right now, that was put together last year by the Migrant, I think, Action Center, describing the conditions that migrant care workers experienced once COVID hit, literally locked in their homes with their employers with no recourse. And, what kind of, the exploitative, we have in Canada, these are programs that are structured to, are exploitatively structured. So these women have very little recourse. Obviously at the same time, the machinery of state ground to a halt. Certainly at Immigration Canada, applications for permanent residency and the like became delayed. A long waiting list, number in years and years and years just became that much longer. And what recourse did these people have? Had to be attached to the same employer. Hugely exploited set of situation. Certainly some of the labor groups working with migrants certainly affected change. We saw that with agricultural workers when it became clear that the agricultural workers living in, terrible conditions on farms in southwestern Ontario and other places, subject becoming ill and so forth, not accessing health care. You saw, and lack of enforcement by the provincial state. There were some reforms brought in, but certainly not to the degree. And we see that even again this year, where you would have thought, having learned the experience of 2020, we would have made changes such than 20, and it did not facilitate that kind of change. In fact, the whole immigration is being refined. I think it's really in play right now. There was a program introduced where, what did they call them? The angels. They were literally undocumented workers and migrant workers volunteering, not volunteering, putting up their hand to work in devastated long-term care homes that were literally where the staff and with shortages were most acute. So these people going into work in those settings, some of whom the federal government introduced a program would recognize or put them on a path toward permanent residency, not others. So you could be the janitor there who was at equal risk, was not afforded this option. So it's in play in Canada. Certainly we've not moved forward with a much more progressive vision. And I think really the fear is, in terms of we're talking about reproducing dynamics, that we're opening the door to increased use of temporary work labor in Canada, looking at those shortages, institutionalizing a point system that awards, that privileges higher, workers with higher, consider more highly educated and higher skill levels. All of that just reproduces disadvantage and puts these workers at tremendous, at risk. So Yeah, I think it's in play. I think it's really important to pay attention to. I think things are shifting right now. I know we're tired. It's really, really important to start documenting what's happening on the ground, and putting forward progressive policy alternatives again around which communities can mobilize and press for change.
Great, thank you. I think now we're down to 3 minutes. What I'm going to do is read, there's 3 great questions. They're quite different. I'm going to read them out, and if everyone wants to jump in 60 seconds, or you can leave it, but final thoughts, respond to the question or not. So I've got from Ryan Katz-Rosine, thanks to all the speakers for a very interesting session. I was really struck by the connections Elizabeth made between care work and the ecological crisis, wondering if you might be able to tease that relationship out a bit more to us. I've got Haley Stevenson, excellent discussion. I wondered about the contributors' experience as academics. As feminist political economists, do they perceive greater openness from the discipline of political economy to feminist perspectives? I think it's a great question. And then from Rianne Mao, I think the COVID and the climate crisis has created an opening for a feminist Green New Deal, but what are the dangers posed by rumblings of war on the Russian front and with China? It seems to me that these come together with the right-wing populism to pose a real danger. Okay, big questions. Okay. Maybe I'll start with Genevieve. If you want to jump in, we'll move Genevieve, Elizabeth, Sharon, and Catherine. Again, very, very quick responses.
Okay, I'll take Haley's question. Hi, Haley, nice to have you with us. I think it has been very interesting to be a feminist political economist in this moment. On the one hand, there's been a vindication, I think, of people waking up and being like, oh, maybe that stuff that you guys research is actually relevant and interesting. And on the other hand, people making grand proclamations about like, wow, healthcare and all these things are very gendered, like as though nobody's, studied that for the past 30 or 40 or many, many more years. So there's been a strange sense in which people have acknowledged, with or without due credit, the work that's been done. On the other hand, I do think we're seeing a bit of a buckling down of people being like, the more that there's attention towards some of to gender and to race and to other previously marginalized topics and perspectives, I think we're seeing a buckling down of people saying, no, my theory does encompass that. Like, we have been talking about that already for 30 years and you guys are wrong and you're misreading. And so I think it's a kind of dual moment here. And I'd be curious if we have more time to hear how you found it, and others on the panel.
Excellent. Elizabeth.
I take Ryan's question. Thank you for that question. I think the easiest way to answer that is just to rethink how much women and nature have been associated traditionally, both in the way people think, but also in the way in which they're treated in the economy. And so there's different entry points. I'd encourage you to read around on feminist ecology to think about the way in which traditionally classical literature has thought about women and nature as being parallel in the way in which they need to be treated and controlled and so on, but also in the way in which political economy, for example, thinks about accumulation and primitive accumulation and the violence that is perpetrated in extracting value on the one hand from nature, but on the other hand from women's unpaid labor. So there's a lot of parallels and connections that one can make, and I hope I whetted your appetite.
Excellent. Sharon.
No, I have nothing to add to this except to point to Rianne's question about Russia and China. And I just don't think that 20 seconds is where we can, but Rianne, you and I can talk about it another time.
Excellent. I wanted to make sure it was out there anyway. Yeah, thank you. Catherine.
Hello to Rianne. I struck with the Green New Deal. That's I think that's a really interesting and a feminist Green New Deal. And here in Canada, I don't think that has taken off in a way. I mean, a lot more work in that in the UK and the like, and grassroots mobilization behind a feminist environmental vision. I think that's clearly more work where we need to do, and to look at the obvious parallels and synergies, I hate that word anyway, to be had with the land back movement and decolonization. I think those ties are just starting to be made. I think you see that kind of activists and intellectual scholarship sort of tilling that ground. But I mean, that most certainly is the way forward. I mean, we have to start seeing these internesting crises and to envisioning, nested solutions that can help us unpack where we are right now. So, yes.
Thank you. Look, for all of the pessimism, that was, I feel uplifted. There's at least, if nothing else, this conversation has been a delight. And so thank you for that. And thank you very much for our audience. And yes, obviously we're just really starting the conversation, but thanks for getting it going. And yeah, thank you very much. This was wonderful.